Live for God Studio Productions.
This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
Agreement that's not really a piece of agreement as much as it is okay, we'll hold off if you'll hold off on the fighting between Hamas in Gaza and Israel. The thing that Israel is having to deal with right now is, wouldn't you know it, the United Nations decides that they need to put them on trial for war crimes against Gaza, against Hamas. Which, when you think of it, it's just crazy, you know, what they're doing here. But that's kind of the way Israel gets treated. And so Hamas starts it all. They launch rockets and everything. They destroy some Israeli property, and they continue launching rockets at Israeli civilians. Israel responds, the IDF responds, their military responds by targeting military locations. Now, Hamas uses women and children as human shields. And so why isn't that a war crime? I don't know. But they're in this fake, it's not fake, I mean it's a real trial, but it's just like so misguided trial that they're bringing these charges up against Israel. Nobody's mentioning the fact that Hamas, A, started it, B, used women and children as human shields, and then just they were attacking civilians and not attacking military bases or military outposts or military buildings or anything like that. It's just strange, and it's kind of the way of the world right now. But that's what's going on. You'll be hearing a lot about these war crimes that Israel is being accused of, and just, you know, Israel has just learned that this is what goes on. It's part of the bias against Israel, and we're going to have to be watching that as we go along. It kind of fits in with as what we've talked about as we've looked at end times, how everybody eventually begins turning against Israel. And by the way, that includes America. And so at some point we're going to see the nations really, all nations will be standing against Israel. That's just something the Bible talks about. Elsewhere in the news, let me show you this little story in the news. That's in Tel Aviv. And two people were arrested. This is serious news, folks. Two people were arrested in Tel Aviv because they entered an elevator with a horse in a luxurious skyscraper in Tel Aviv. And the owner of the horse came to visit his friend who lives in the building, and he went up to the 6th floor via the elevator with his horse. And the tenants that live in the building, they believe that the owner of the horse brought the animal from one of the nearby farms, apparently lives there, and they called the police. The Tel Aviv police came, and they said, building's privately owned, we can't do anything about it, sorry. So they just got all bent out of shape. But apparently, if you're in Tel Aviv, you might start seeing horses in elevators as friends visit friends. But when I saw that in the news, and I thought, you know, everything that Israel's going through, I hope they all see this, and you know, it's on TV. All right, let's get back to what's actually what we want to take a look at today. We are seeing and hearing more and more the word Zion. Have you noticed that? And I'm not talking about the basketball player. I'm talking about the word Zion in relationship to Israel. And it is, and I want us to get into that and take a look at today in Matthew chapter 24, what Jesus is talking about when he talks about the desolation, the abomination of desolation that happens. And he only mentions it, it's only mentioned in one verse, but it plays a key part in the end times. And to understand it and to see it, we need to come back and take a look at this word Zion. Zion comes from an ancient Hebrew word, Tzion, which is T-S-Y-O-N, basically, Tzion. And so we've turned it into Zion. But Zion was originally a hill fortress, if you will, that was captured by David. And then it was eventually, in the Bible, named the city of David. And then today we know that area as the name that was given to it was Yerushalayim, which means city of peace, or Jerusalem. So the word Zion literally means a mountain or a shelter. The biblical writers use the term to represent one of three things. First of all, the hill where the ancient areas of Jerusalem stood, or the city of Jerusalem itself, or the dwelling place of God, the shelter, if you will, of God. And in fact, that was the concept of the temple. The temple it had the Holy of Holies, which was the dwelling place of God on earth. Now, of course, God dwelled in heaven, but on earth he dwelled in the temple, in the Holy of Holies. Now, curiously, the word has taken on a term of disdain and hatred by the enemies of Israel. And as a result, we're hearing a lot, we're seeing a lot of what we call anti-Zionism, or the anti-Zion movement, or anti-Zionists. You'll hear this term talked about a lot, using this word Zion. And I find it interesting that it's even ironic that the enemies of Israel loathingly call Israel Zion. They refer to Israel as Zion. And that basically reaffirms who the nation of Israel represents when you think about it, because it means the mountain or the shelter or the dwelling place of God. So when they are casting aspersions on Israel by referring to them as Zion, what they're saying is they're the dwelling place of God, which kind of affirms what Israel is really all about, what the history of Israel is all about. So this hill fortress, or this mount, if you will, that is in Jerusalem, that David captured, we now refer to as the Temple Mount, Mount Moriah. And it was the former location of the two temples that Israel has had so far, and where the Jews are planning to build a third temple, which of course is a problem because the Muslims declare that site, that mount, that Temple Mount, to be their holy site. And in fact, they have a mosque there and a shrine built on that mount. Let's take an aerial view of the mount, the Temple Mount. Take a look at this. This is the dome of the rock. That dome you see in all of the pictures. You see those pictures of Jerusalem? That's what you see, that dome. That is the earliest Muslim shrine that we know of in existence. And so that's what it is. It's a shrine to Muhammad. They say that Muhammad came to Jerusalem and he ascended into heaven from that location. And that's why they have that shrine there. Right here is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is not a mosque. This is a shrine, a memorial. This is the mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Right here is the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, which is really some people say that it was part of the temple, but it's not. It was a retaining wall, really, that Herod had built, because this area, Herod rebuilt the temple, and it was rebuilt in 37 BC, or finished in 37 BC. And he expanded this area to 37 acres, and so this was part of that retaining area for that 37 acres. So anyway, having said that, this is kind of this is the Temple Mount, and that's where the Jews want to build their third temple. Now we know there have been two previous temples. One was small, one was large. Take a look at this little diagram of the two temples. The one on the left is the temple, the first temple that was Solomon's temple. That was Solomon's temple. And you can't really see it from where you're sitting, but there on the right in the front, that was the altar. And this was, in that area there was the holy place where the Holy of Holies was. And that was the size of Solomon's temple. This was the temple that Herod finished in 37 BC. And it was the second temple. This was the one that was completely destroyed with no stone left on top of another stone. It was completely leveled by the Romans in 70 AD. Now compare the sizes. This right here is the size of what is this? This, that is an American football field. It's an American football field, and you can see above, right? I think you're going to get the best of me. No. Here you are. Okay, so anyway, look, that's Solomon's symbol on top, and that's the Herod's one in the middle there, the larger one. So Solomon's temple, you could have put about 3 of those inside Herod's temple. That's the difference in size. Now, it's a pretty good bet that it is the third temple that they build is going to be larger than the first temple, probably not as big as Herod's temple. So where will it go on the Temple Mount? Now, look, here's another aerial shot of the Temple Mount, the 37 acres. This is an actual picture of it. There's the Dome of the Rock, and there's the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Over here to the left is the Wailing Wall, right here. That little right here. So where would they put the temple? Well, there is a couple of options. The clearest place would be over here to the right. See all those trees and everything to the right? That's really kind of a park area. It has fountains and walkways, and it's a very beautiful place. But the Muslims say, no, they can't have, that's their area. They say, no, that's our park. You can't build a temple there. The other place is behind the dome. See all those trees behind it and off to the left of it over here? That area is possible. You might be able to squeeze in the temple, depending on the size. Now, there are a lot of purists, Jewish, who want the temple built where the dome is, where the Dome of the Rock is. They just want to knock the dome down and put their temple right there in the middle. And they're insisting on that. So obviously that's creating some real stress and some real problems. Now, those are the possibilities, and certainly what Jews and Arabs and Muslims are arguing about. Where, even if you got to build a temple, where would you put it? Because you're not going to take any of our property. Now, I appreciate the Messianic Jewish Bible Society for sharing some information that I think concisely and accurately explains much of what is going on right now in regards to planning the third temple. Now, I want to preface that by reminding you that, as we saw last Sunday, the end of chapter 22 ends with this idea into 24, ends with Jesus. It talks about Jesus walking away from the temple. And I mentioned that it's important to understand that was put there for a reason, because Jesus never came back to the temple. And there is no indication in the Bible that he will ever come back to the temple. And certainly that temple was destroyed in 70 AD. But even the third temple, which is going to be built, and Revelation talks about it, there's no indication that he's going back to the temple. And there are a number of reasons for this. Number one, because it no longer contains it will not contain the Holy of Holies. Now, one of the purposes of the temple was to contain the place where God would rest, where he would be sheltered on earth. But now the Bible tells us that we are the temple of God, which means that we contain the Holy of Holies. And inside us is where Holy Spirit lives. So there's no reason for there to be a temple, because the Holy Spirit now dwells in us. And the Bible refers to us as his temple, as his people. So there is no reason for the temple to have a Holy of Holies, because God won't be there. Well, what's going to be there? Well, the Bible clearly teaches, and that's what we're looking at today, is that instead of the presence of God, there will be the presence of Satan, the Antichrist. The presence of the Antichrist will be there, and that is the abomination of desolation. The presence of Satan. And the Antichrist will be revealing who the Antichrist really is at this abomination of desolation. The second reason that the temple isn't necessary is because blood sacrifices are no longer required. Jesus was the final blood sacrifice. There is no need for more blood sacrifices. Now, there will be some sacrifices. There will be some grain sacrifices. There will be some celebratory sacrifices. The Bible says that we are to offer sacrifices of praise. That we're to live our lives out glorifying God. That we're to sacrifice through gifts to alms, if you will, to take care of people in need. Those are sacrifices that the Bible talks about us offering. And we're to offer those to the Lord in the name of Christ, in the name of God. So, but the sacrificial purpose of the temple no longer exists. Now they wanted to, and they're planning on doing sacrifices, but as far as God's concerned, and the Bible clearly teaches this, that there is no need for any more blood sacrifices. Hebrews chapter 10 talks about it. There's no need for it because the final sacrifice has already been offered. Now, but I want us to understand where the Jews are coming from that are seeking to rebuild the third temple and look at what's going to happen with it. So this Temple Institute exists, as well as the Temple Mount and the Eretz Yisrael Faithful Movement. These exist, these organizations that, well, there's two main Jewish organizations that exist and are responsible for making preparations for the third temple. And they're very far along in their preparations. And so they're planning now on reinstating sacrificial worship. That is their goal, even though the Bible clearly teaches there's no need for it, and it is really against what God really wants. And it's amazing to me how far along they are, as I mentioned, in these preparations. In fact, there are rumors and even that even the materials for the construction of the temple have already been purchased and are being stored and are ready to be used. At a moment's notice, they can start building the temple right away. All of that is in place. So let's look at some of the plans that have been made. First of all, I want you to take a look at the temple ritual garments and vessels that have been created. Now, these are just diagrams of some of them, but this Temple Institute has been working on these to create them. And there are a number of different robes for priests who are at different levels that they wear these robes and these garments, and they wear them for different reasons, different holidays, different celebrations, that sort of thing. And you'll notice that they're very, for example, at the bottom, you'll see at the bottom it looks like little tassels. Those are gold pomegranates that they've fashioned out, and so it's very detailed. And some of the details involved are, well, first of all, everything about it has purpose and a plan. It means something, and one of those things is this breastplate that you'll see right on the chest. There's a breastplate that hangs right on the chest, and that breastplate is magnificent. According to the Torah, the fabric is made with 28-ply thread, and so there are all these threads that are woven together to create this 28-ply thread, and the thread itself is made up of either different colors. There's sky blue, there's dark red, and there's crimson wool. It's made out of wool, but through it is woven gold thread. Pure gold thread. They have, it's just amazing how many yards and yards and yards and yards of pure gold thread that they have created. And when it's all finished, when that breastplate is finished, this is what it looks like. Take a look at this. The breastplate which hangs right there on the chest, is set with 4 rows of small square stones. And these small square stones are put in place with gold braid. And the 12 stones represent each of the 12 tribes of Israel, and the name of the corresponding tribe is engraved on each stone. That's how much detail goes into what they've done and what they're doing with the robes that are involved in the temple worship. Now, there are some of the elements that will be used within the temple that they've already been created. They're ready to go. For example, look at this. These are copper vessels that will be used in the third temple. On the left, you'll see something that looks kind of like a walk. That's the only way I could describe it. It's actually a 3-tiered stand, and it's called an abuv, and it's used for roasting the omer for the Passover. And it's very detailed, and it's, the sizes and everything, even the copper, have been specified how it's to be done, and they've done it the way that it was done as they're taught in Old Testament teachings. To the right of that, right down in front, that is that contains coal for roasting the barley for certain sacrifices. And then at the very back, that is just a vessel, a copper vessel that's used in preparing a meal offering. So there are many different kinds of offerings that they will offer that they're basic food type offerings. And those are examples of things that have already been created. They're there ready to be used. And one of the things the Bible talks about that will also be used in the temple is a golden menorah. Well, the golden menorah is a 7-branched candelabra, basically. And it has already been created, as you can see there. That is an actual picture of it. And that has been created along with Levitical music instruments such as silver trumpets and lyres and harps to worship God, just as David did some 3,000 years ago. I know some of you are going to be disappointed, but there will be no harmonicas used in temple worship. I don't know what you're going to do, but that's just part of it. Now, this 24-karat golden menorah was recreated back to specifications by this Temple Institute, and as I mentioned, it's ready. It's ready to be used. Now, the Temple Institute has is basically it is an institute. It is a school. They're studying the Bible. They're studying the Torah to make sure that they build everything exactly to the right specifications, and they're very detailed about it. Even to the point where they are training certified, DNA-tested descendants of the high priest Aaron to perform the temple duties. So, in other words, it's not just anybody can come in and say, oh, I want to be a high priest. No. You've got to be a descendant of Aaron. And they're using DNA testing to do that. And it's amazing how detailed they go into this. I was doing some research about how they have done some research for, like, for example, the Davidic line. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But that there are whole groups of families that have the paperwork and the details all mapped out to prove that they are from the Davidic line. And they're doing the same thing for the line of Aaron, the high priest, to prove that they're from that line. And you have to be proven that you're, by DNA testing, proven that you're from that line to be qualified to be trained and certified to become a priest in the third temple. And then there's the final element that's being prepared, and that is what's called the red heifer. The red heifer is being bred in Israel to be sacrificed in the ritual of purification of the priests and the vessels. And I think there's also an element of national purification also in that sacrifice, in that process. And so, but they have to be purified to be able to formally enter the Holy of Holies. And so this heifer has to be perfect, as all of the sacrifices do. And so they're breeding these heifers and studying them, and it's very, like I mentioned, it's so detailed. They check them even to the point of checking, like, for example, if there's a speck in the iris, not qualified. Has to be perfect. They have to breed the perfect red heifer for this to happen. And as they say, we're almost there. They know that they're that close. And so this red heifer plays a very important part, because the red heifer will be sacrificed when the Messiah enters the temple, they say. Now, I want you to catch something interesting about the tradition of the sacrifice of the red heifer. There have only been 9 red heifer sacrifices throughout the history of Israel. Only 9 in the entire history of Israel. And the names of each of the high priests have been recorded with each particular sacrifice, all the way back to Aaron. And it's believed that the 10th red heifer sacrifice will be at the introduction of the Messiah to the temple. So 9 have happened previously. The final one, which is the 10th one, will be when the Messiah appears to the temple. So everything is ready for the rebuilding of the third temple. Everything is ready except one thing: the land on which it is to be built. That's the only thing that's impeding them from building the third temple. Everything else is in place. Since 1967, the Muslim world has gone to extremes to claim that entire 37-acre Temple Mount is theirs. It's their own sacred land. They claim that it is theirs. And they call that piece of land, we call it the Temple Mount, they call it the Noble Sanctuary. And it is their sacred land. And they call that piece of land the Noble Sanctuary because on it is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, along with the Muslim shrine, the Dome of the Rock. However, history bears out that the Temple Mount does not belong to the Muslim world. Now, some of them are going to be watching this online, and we'll probably get all kinds of hate email and posts and everything. some of the different posts about this, but hear me out, because it's very clear from history that they do not have ownership of the Temple Mount. Around 4,000 years ago, Mount Moriah was the biblical location where God asked Abraham to offer his promised son as a sacrifice. It was on that mount that he offered Isaac as his sacrifice, and obviously God intervened and provided the sacrifice of the lamb. Some 900 years later, David captured that area, which is now known as Jerusalem, but he captured that area from the Jebusites. And he could have confiscated the mount as wartime plunder, but he didn't. What he chose to do was he allowed the king, the Jebusite king, he allowed the king to keep ownership of some of his land and to dwell there in the land. David allowed that. And he allowed him to have Mount Moriah, for the king to continue owning Mount Moriah. There was no reason. David didn't want it for anything. And then sometime later, God sent the prophet Gad to speak to David. It's in 2 Samuel, starting with Samuel 24. 2 Samuel 24, starting with verse 18. Look at this. And Gad, that was the prophet, came that day to David and said to him, "Go up, raise an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite." Now that was the king. That was the Jebusite king, Araunah. And he owned that mount. So there is the clarification that he owned the mount. It was his. So David goes to Araunah. And he says, I'd like to build an altar on that high place, on that mount. And Araunah says, well, you can have it. He says, I'm not going to use it. And he says, he tries to give the land to David for free. In fact, he not only says, you can have the land, I'll give you the oxen for the sacrifice. And David said no. He insisted on buying it. It's in 2 Samuel 24, starting with verse 24. Look at this. But the king, David, said to Araunah, when he was offered to give him the land, he said, "No, but I will buy it from you for a price. I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing." So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. And David built there an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So the Lord responded to the plea for the land, and the plague was averted from Israel. That was one of the reasons for the sacrifice, was to seek to please God. So that is how this Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount, came to legally belong to David and his descendants, by the way. Because once you own the land, it passed down to your descendants. So David legally owned the land. Araunah tried to give it to him. He said, "No, I want to buy it." He buys it, and it legally is his now. Years later, David decides to build a temple to the Lord on this particular mount. He was not able to do it, but Solomon, his son, did. That was the first temple. It's in 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1, and look what it says. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to David his father, at the place that David had appointed on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, or Araunah, which is another way of saying the same name. So it was very clear this was the site that David had bought from Araunah, and he owned. He legally owned that site. So the Temple Mount is not only Judaism's holiest site, it is uniquely the property of King David and his descendants. And the descendants can trace that back through their lineage back to David and prove that they're the descendants and that land is still legally theirs. It has not been sold to anyone else. Nobody else has the deed to that property. It is theirs. But the Muslims will not accept that. And to protect their noble sanctuary, as they call it, the Muslim world has become experts at organizing riots on the Temple Mount and terror throughout Israel. They have invested in that in Israel. And as we've seen in the last few weeks,
These matters are boiling over. It's getting worse. And so what is going to happen? What can we expect to happen? Well, that is exactly what Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 24 that we're looking at. So I had said all of that as an introduction to our lesson.
On behalf of Dan Hurst and the Open Class, we want to thank you for watching. We hope it was a blessing.